Shalom and good morning. This is Daniel Stern of the Netivyah Bible Instruction Ministry coming to you from Jerusalem. And today we're going to talk about the showdown between the judicial branch and the executive and legislative branches in Israel. But before we get into that, I can't but not update you on the weekend and early week news. For example, on Saturday, 4 Israeli hostages, soldiers, females were released. But that was a breach of the agreement. Hamas was supposed to release the female civilians before the soldiers. And one of the female civilians was not released. Hamas said it's because she's held by an offshoot of the Islamic Jihad and they couldn't reach her. Nevertheless, it's a breach of the agreement, and consequently, Israel did not allow the residents of northern Gaza to return to northern Gaza starting on Sunday morning. Obviously, that produced a lot of pressure on the Hamas, and they have since provided signs of life and will probably even release this 29-year-old civilian female who was kidnapped from her home on October 7th. They will probably release her before the next batch of hostages are released on Saturday. And as a result, from this morning at 7 a.m., residents of northern Gaza have been allowed to head north on foot and from 9 a.m. in vehicles. Additionally, the Israeli army, the IDF, has allowed the United States contract workers that will be in charge of supervision to make sure that terrorists and arms do not go to North Gaza to come into the area and check it out. Now, obviously, my opinion is that they'll fail miserably and that the north of Gaza will be full of weapons and Hamas, but that's a separate matter. Kind of separate. Anyways, additionally, the treaty in southern Lebanon, the 60-day truce, ended yesterday, but Israel has said that since Hezbollah and the Lebanese army have not done anything to implement their parts in this treaty, that they would not be able to leave the points in southern Lebanon that they are occupying. As a result, the treaty was extended another month. But during that time, people in southern Lebanon tried to return to the territories that the IDF are controlling, and consequently 22 people were killed and over 100 were wounded. I don't have the breakdown of how many of those were Hezbollah terrorists and how many support terrorists and how many are innocents. I apologize, don't have it. In addition, there's a new idea by President Trump regarding the Gazan civilians, but we'll talk about that next video. And now, I want to do somewhat of a deep dive into a matter that is a bit complicated and possibly less newsworthy and less spiritual, but has a huge effect on Israel and the world. And that is the divide between the judicial branch of Israel and the legislative and executive branches of Israel. So to start, Israel is a parliamentary democracy, which means that the people, the nation, vote once every 4 years for a party, and the parties receive mandates in the 120-seat parliament, known as the Knesset, and when there is the larger parties, largest usually, but not always, the larger parties attempt to create a government with a coalition of other parties that together have at least 61 of the 120 mandates. And once they have that, then they form a government, and that is the executive branch. The legislative branch, of course, their job is to vote on laws, create laws, and a lot of oversight. The executive branch, their job is the operation of the country, whether it's the taxes, the education, the health ministry, the army, and so on. The judicial branch, as in most countries, their job is to run the courts and in some sense, also oversight on the executive branch when needed, when people have problems with the executive branch, they can bring it to a special part of the Supreme Court. In addition, they have taken upon themselves, and we'll go into why and how and when, the job which they were not given and is not part of their authority by law, which is to criticize, review, and oversight of laws. Now, it's worth noting that Israel does not have a constitution, but Israel has a series of base laws. That base is the word translated from Hebrew. I could also use the word foundation laws or primary laws that need a special vote in order to pass, and those laws are meant to be chapters within the future constitution. Now, in the 90s, the early 90s, Chief Justice Aharon Barak, the president of the Supreme Court, made the decision that the base law, human dignity and freedom, it will act as a constitution for the state of Israel, and it will be the primary law, and any law or decision that goes against it can be struck down. I want to note that this law, the freedom and dignity of human law, passed only with about, I think, 29 to 33 parliament members of the 120. So it certainly did not receive a 61 majority, but I guess there weren't enough who opposed it at the time. People didn't think it was important, but my point is one cannot give it the credit of a strong majority law. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court Justice Aharon Barak, from that point on, made the decision that the judges will be very active and will look to criticize, review, and strike down decisions and laws. And since then, they have been doing just that. And 2 years ago, the government that was formed, the coalition that was formed on the basis that they would make a reform in the judicial system in order to balance out the situation which had happened in the previous decade and 2 decades, where the Supreme Court had canceled laws and executive decisions in such a way that it harmed the state of Israel, the people of Israel, and the government of Israel. For example, in Israel there is a problem of illegal migration from Africa, specifically Eritrea. And, well, one can consider it a problem or not, but there is an issue. And the government, at the request of many citizens, made decisions in order to bring to an end that issue by gathering the illegal work migrants from that country and other countries in Africa and placing them in a detention camp in the Negev, in the south of Israel, on their way to being deported. But the court multiple times struck down the laws that the government enacted in order, the legislative branch, the Knesset, and the government enacted in order to do that. Likewise, the courts have done other such things. For example, they have decided that they have the ability to decide if the prime minister is unable to perform his duty, not medically, but for other reasons. This is once again, I'll remind you, this is a prime minister whose coalition, whose party was elected by the people. Now, before I go into the judicial reform and the recent event that is why we're having this conversation, I will say that the judges are elected by a committee of 9 people. 3 judges, 2 members of the government, 1 member of the opposition to the government, 1 member of the legislative committee who's part of the coalition, one member of the legislative committee who's not part of the coalition, and one member of the Lawyers Association, the bar. Now, the judges, all of them, are far left, very liberal, very progressive. For decades, they have been cloning themselves, voting only on people like themselves. This is also a problem in the army, but we're not going to talk about that today. In the current committee, there are, as I mentioned, 9 people. 3 judges, 1 member of the opposition, 1 member of the Bar Association, and 1 member of the legislative opposition. That's 6. And there are 3 members of the coalition. Now, what that basically means is that the judges are able to veto any decision they don't like. And with them, always, members of the left, be they in the opposition or the coalition, always vote with the judges. Because the judges are left, the opposition is left. They always vote together. You can look historically, you can check votes. The judges and the left-wing parties vote identically, which also tells us, of course, reveals to us the judge's position. Similarly, also the Bar Association votes with the judges because obviously no one would consider it a conflict of interest to have the lawyers vote with judges, because if they vote against them, then the judges will get payback later. So no one would consider that a conflict of interest. Duh. Anyways, now, in order to have this committee meet, it needs to be called to meet, invited to meet by the Justice Minister, and it needs to have 7 members in order to make any decision. Now, what happened yesterday, we'll get to in a moment. But first, 2 years ago, the government was formed in order to reform the judicial system, to change the way judges were chosen, so that not all judges think the same and are the same and are a hindrance to the right-wing governments, which they always are. Additionally, there are more players in the field, such as the chief prosecutor and the DA, the district attorney, which in Israel are 2 separate positions, and they too generally are very anti-right-wing, very progressive, very liberal. We can see that the previous district attorney, Mendelblit, was anti-right. The current district attorney, Gili Barhav Miara, has done everything in her power to oppose the current government, while the previous government that was led by Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett and was progressive, liberal, and left, she did nothing to even consider opposing them and supported every illegal decision they made. In any case, so the Justice Minister was elected on a platform of judicial reforms to bring things back into balance. Consequently, there were 2 years of demonstrations, burning of the streets, academia shut down, industry shut down, workers' guilds shut down, lawyers' bars shut down, everyone was demonstrating, riots all over the country was burning, people were refusing to go in the army, doctors were refusing to work, and so on and so forth. All of these great shining knights of democracy fighting against democracy. Now, as a result of October 7th, the issue was taken off the table for a while, and things calmed down. But recently, the judge Amit, who was the replacement president of the Supreme Court, because the president resigned, was wanting to be elected as president by this committee. But unfortunately for him, it came out that he has done many, many, many different crimes regarding illegal permits in his house, regarding educating in rulings that relate to him personally and his finances, and so on and so forth. And the justice minister made the decision that he was not going to convene the committee to elect him because he felt that there needed to be a proper investigation into the Judge Amit. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court, once again with no conflict of interests, decided that they were going to convene this committee, which by law can only be convened by the justice minister, and they were going to elect him anyways. So, last night, the committee met, not in the justice ministry as they have every single time since they first met in history, but in the courthouse, and the three members of the coalition, the justice minister and two others, did not come to the meeting, so there were only 6 of them. Might I remind you that it required 7 for any decision to be made. This, again, is in part of the base law. But they voted on this gentleman, this judge, to be the next president of the Supreme Court. Now, obviously, this is an illegal committee that convened illegally and made a decision illegally, but nevertheless, the left-wing progressive elements in society, be it the Bar Association, the President of Israel, former leader of the Labor Party, the left-wing Labor Party, the former Prime Minister Yair Lapid, who is the leader, of course, of the left-wing Yesh Atid Party, all congratulated the judge on his nomination and said that it's a shame it took so long. And the justice minister and other right-wing politicians said that it's an illegal decision and that they will not work with him. So the question now is, why is that important to Israel? Well, need I remind you that the Supreme Court has took it upon themselves to strike down laws, to decide if Benjamin Netanyahu, the elected Prime Minister of Israel, is capable of serving. And some of the laws that they strike down are laws that relate to the protection of soldiers, to hostage deals, to rules of engagement, to demonstration ability, to, in every direction, every aspect of life. The Supreme Court, which should be fair and balanced and clean, is now stained and marred, and this will be, one of two things will happen. Either this will motivate the right, which is a majority of Israeli citizens, and their representatives to truly do a reform that will change the face of Israel forever, or nothing will happen and we will continue down the slope that is leading Israel from a democracy to dictatorship. Because right now, the Supreme Court justices are above the law, they decide the law, and they are not elected by the people. They choose themselves. And that is a situation that we cannot have. So, please, pray that this situation comes to a godly resolution. Thank you. Now, I might add, someone asked me a few weeks ago why I'm talking about the situation in South Korea. And it's because it's the same thing in Israel, in South Korea, in Brazil, in Italy, in Hungary, in the United States, and in the rest of the world. It's a war between those who want to accept every form of evil, every form of human action, whether it's radical Islam or transgenderism, and a war between those who want law and order and family. And, just to finish, I want to remind you all, please comment, argue, discuss politely and pleasantly, and I'll be glad to answer and make videos on subjects that interest you. And if you like this, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell and like the video. God bless you all.